The truth had been whispered behind silk fans for 3 years, but that night it finally cut through her composure. He married her for the land and nothing more. Look at him. He cannot even bring himself to glance her way. Genevieve, Duchess of Rothwell, stood near the towering floral arrangements, her heart a stone sinking in her chest. She did not need to turn to know that her husband, Alexander St. Clair, the formidable Duke of Rothwell, had just entered the ballroom and walked past her without a word. The cool draft of his passing stirred the hem of her gown, and she closed her eyes for one fragile moment, willing the sting of tears away. She had been invisible for so long that she almost believed she had learned to bear it. Almost. Genevieve opened her eyes and watched Alexander bow elegantly over Lady Cordelia Ashby's gloved hand. The widow laughed, her dark curls catching the candlelight, and Alexander's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile Genevieve had never once received. A raw, hollow ache spread through her chest. She set her untouched champagne on a passing tray and clasped her trembling hands together, her wedding ring cold against her fingers. No one saw. No one ever did. The ballroom glittered with the cream of London society, all of them eager to catch a glimpse of the Duke of Rothwell, a man who moved like a shadow through his own power. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter storms, and his face rarely betrayed any feeling. Genevieve had married him 3 years ago when she was barely 19, believing that duty and patience might one day bloom into affection. She had tried everything: gentle words, small attentions, quiet support. He accepted them with cool politeness and gave nothing back. Slowly, the hope had begun to wither. Tonight, it was crumbling entirely. She turned away from the sight of her husband charming another woman and walked toward the terrace doors, desperate for air. The night breeze touched her cheeks like a balm, and she stepped outside, letting the music fade behind her. The terrace overlooked a moonlit garden, and she gripped the stone balustrade, breathing slowly. She would not cry. She was a duchess. She had been taught to endure. Footsteps sounded behind her. Genevieve stiffened, expecting a servant or an overbold gentleman, but when she turned, it was her husband's closest friend, Lord William Becket, his expression unusually gentle. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. I saw you leave, and I merely wish to say that you are not as unseen as you believe." She stared at him, her throat tight. He gave a small, sad smile and retreated before she could reply. That unexpected kindness planted a splinter of hope she could not shake. Perhaps Alexander's coldness was not disgust. Perhaps there was something wounded beneath it. Perhaps if she tried once more, she might reach him. The following morning, Genevieve rose early and went to the kitchens, a thing no duchess was expected to do. She prepared a tray with fresh bread, butter, and a pot of his preferred black tea, and carried it to his study herself. The door was ajar. She heard Alexander's low voice speaking to his steward, Mr. Hale, and she paused, not wishing to interrupt. "The estate reports are satisfactory," Alexander said. "The Duchess's allowance will continue as arranged. She has her duties, I have mine. There is no sentiment between us." The word struck her like a blade. No sentiment. Her hands began to shake so violently that the teacup rattled. She turned silently and walked back the way she came, her vision blurring. In the corridor, a maid saw her face and looked away quickly, and Genevieve knew the humiliation was now complete. She disposed of the tray and went to her private sitting room, where she sat very still for a long time. The splinter of hope dissolved into nothing. She had her answer. That afternoon she began to change. She did not weep or rage. She simply stopped waiting. She stopped arranging her schedule around his. She stopped watching the doorway for his silhouette. She stopped hopping for a kind glance. The Duchess became a quiet, efficient presence in Rothwell Hall, cordial and distant. Alexander noticed the shift within a week, though he could not name it. She was still polite, still graceful, but the light in her eyes had dimmed, and she no longer sought him out. He told himself it was a relief. He had never wanted emotional entanglement. After the disaster of his first marriage, after Helena's betrayal and the secret that still clawed at his soul, he had sworn never to be vulnerable again. Genevieve had been a duty, a bright-eyed girl he married to save her family from ruin. He had paid her father's crushing gambling debts without her knowledge, protecting her from being sold to a lecherous old earl. He had watched her from a distance before the betrothal, drawn to her quiet laughter and gentle spirit, and had convinced himself that he was merely acting out of honor. But when she became his wife, the nearness of her terrified him. He built walls of ice to keep her out, because if he let her in, she would see the broken, unworthy man beneath, and she would leave him just as Helena had tried to leave him before she died. So he kept her at arm's length, certain that cold indifference was safer than the agony of hopping for love. And now she was pulling away, and he felt a strange, gnawing emptiness that he refused to name. A month later, Genevieve attended a garden party at the neighboring estate of Lord and Lady Prescott. Alexander had declined to accompany her, claiming urgent business, and she went alone, wearing a pale lavender gown that made her look like a spring blossom. She walked through the manicured hedges, feeling more relaxed than she had in months, until a familiar voice called her name. "Evie, good heavens, is that truly you?" She spun around and found herself face to face with Nathaniel Prescott, the second son of the house, whom she had not seen since childhood. He had the same unruly brown hair and warm hazel eyes, though now he was taller and broader, his skin tanned from years abroad. "Nathaniel," she breathed, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "You've returned." He took her hand with an easy familiarity, his grin lighting up his whole face. "At last. I've been in the West Indies collecting botanical specimens, but tell me, what has become of the little girl who used to climb trees with me at Ashby Manor? You are a duchess now." His gaze swept over her with admiration, and she felt a flutter of something she had nearly forgotten, the simple pleasure of being seen. They walked together through the gardens for an hour, and she told him about her life in careful, edited phrases. He seemed to sense the shadows behind her words, but he did not press. Instead, he made her laugh with tales of tropical flowers and mischievous monkeys. And she found herself relaxing in a way she never could at Rothwell Hall. Before she left, Nathaniel pressed a small, leather-bound sketchbook into her hands. "I remember you loved to draw. I thought you might like to fill this with something beautiful." Genevieve held the gift against her heart, deeply moved. No one had given her such a thoughtful present in years. She thanked him softly and returned home, unaware that one of the stable hands had reported her long walk with Mr. Prescott directly to the Duke. Alexander listened to the report in stony silence. His fingers tightened around the pen he was holding until it threatened to snap. A childhood friend. A man who made his wife laugh, who gave her gifts, who looked at her with open admiration. Something hot and possessive surged through his chest, followed instantly by a wave of shame. He had no right to feel this. He had pushed her away. He had told his steward there was no sentiment between them. Yet the image of Genevieve smiling at another man was unbearable. That evening he appeared at dinner for the first time in a fortnight. Genevieve looked up in surprise when he entered the dining room, her fork poised midair. She was dressed simply, her hair pinned up with less care than usual, and her expression when she saw him was guarded. "Your Grace," she said, rising politely, "I did not expect you." "I decided to join you," he said, his voice clipped. He took his seat at the opposite end of the long table, and the silence that followed was heavy. She resumed eating without attempting conversation, and the absence of her usual gentle inquiries unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He had grown accustomed to her soft attempts to draw him out, and now their absence felt like a door closing. "I trust you enjoyed the garden party," he said finally, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Genevieve glanced at him, a flicker of caution in her eyes. "I did, thank you. Lady Prescott's roses are magnificent this year. I heard you spent a considerable time with her son." She set down her fork carefully. "Nathaniel is an old friend. We were only catching up." "Nathaniel," the name on his lips was like frost. "You address him with familiarity." A spark of defiance lit her gaze. "We have known each other since childhood. I did not think it improper." "It is not improper," Alexander said, though every fiber of his being wanted to forbid her from seeing the man again. He forced himself to take a sip of wine, schooling his features. "Merely unexpected." Genevieve studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a language she had never been taught. "Is there anything else, Your Grace?" The formal title landed like a blow. She had never called him that in private before. He could only shake his head, and she excused herself shortly after, leaving him alone with the cold remains of the meal. He sat there for a long time, the hollow ache in his chest deepening into something that felt terrifyingly like regret. Over the following weeks, Genevieve's distance grew. She began spending her mornings at a small charity school in the village, teaching young girls to read and draw. The work gave her a sense of purpose she had never found in the gilded halls of Rothwell. She laughed more freely, slept better, and the hollow pain in her heart slowly dulled into something she could carry without breaking. Nathaniel visited the school once to donate a collection of pressed flowers for the children, and their easy camaraderie became a quiet comfort. She did not love him, not in the way that made her heart ache, but his friendship was a balm she had desperately needed. Alexander watched her transformation with a growing sense of dread. He saw her leave the house each morning with a lightness in her step, saw the color return to her cheeks, saw the sketches of flowers and landscapes begin to multiply in her sitting room. And he saw Nathaniel Prescott's name appear on a letter delivered to her one afternoon. He stood in the hallway, holding the envelope, and a violent surge of jealousy swept through him. He wanted to tear it open. He wanted to summon her and demand to know the nature of this attachment. But he had no right. He had forfeited that right with 3 years of silence. The emotional breaking point came on a rainy evening in late autumn. Genevieve had returned from the school drenched and shivering, and within hours she was burning with fever. The household flew into a quiet panic. The doctor was summoned, and Alexander found himself barred from her chamber by the housekeeper, who told him firmly that the Duchess needed rest. He paced the corridor like a caged animal, the sound of her labored breathing filtering through the heavy oak door. For the first time in years, the ice around his heart cracked open, and raw, desperate fear flooded in. He could not lose her, not like this, not when he had never told her anything true. In the darkest hour of the night, when the fever broke and she was sleeping peacefully, Alexander slipped into her room. A single candle burned on the bedside table. She looked so fragile against the white pillows, her dark lashes fanned against her pale cheeks. On the small writing desk near the window, a sketchbook lay open. He moved toward it, drawn by a force he could not resist. The page showed a drawing of him, his profile, his brow furrowed in thought, the stern line of his jaw softened by the artist's hand. Beneath it, in her elegant script, were the words, "I waited so long for him to see me. Perhaps I was never meant to be seen." The confession shattered him. He sank into the chair beside her bed, his head bowed, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had loved him. She had loved him all this time, and he had been too afraid, too broken, too proud to let her in. He reached out and gently took her limp hand, pressing it to his lips. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw you. I have always seen you. I was just too much of a coward to show it." When Genevieve recovered, she found him changed. He was present. He brought her tea himself. He sat with her in the library while she read, not speaking but simply near. She did not understand it, and she was too weary to hope again, so she accepted his quiet presence with cautious courtesy. Yet she sensed something shifting, a wall slowly crumbling. Then she found the letters. It happened on a cold November afternoon when she was looking for sealing wax in his study. A small, hidden drawer in the massive desk had been left slightly ajar, and curiosity compelled her to open it. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon and a worn leather journal. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the first letter. It was from her father, written 3 years ago, thanking Alexander profusely for settling the debts that would have ruined them. "You have saved my daughter from a fate worse than poverty, and I am forever in your debt." The words blurred before her eyes. He had paid her father's debts. He had married her not for land, but to rescue her from being bartered to a cruel old earl. The knowledge sent a shockwave through her, and hot tears spilled down her cheeks. Then, with her heart pounding, she opened the journal. The entries were sporadic, spanning the years of their marriage, written in Alexander's sharp, precise hand. The earliest entry was dated a month before their betrothal. I saw her today at the Ashby musicale. She was wearing a blue gown and laughing at something her cousin said, and the sound of it stopped me mid-step. I have never heard anything so lovely. She will never know I was there. Another entry from their wedding night read, "She looked at me with such hope in her eyes, and I could not speak. I am afraid that if I let myself love her, she will discover the broken pieces of me and recoil. Better that she thinks me cold than that she learns the truth and despises me." Genevieve read on, her sobs growing harder to stifle. He wrote of the agony of watching her withdraw, of his jealousy toward Nathaniel Prescott, of his terror when she fell ill. The final entry, penned just days ago, was barely legible, the ink smeared as if by tears. "I love her. I have loved her from the first moment I saw her. And now she is slipping away, and I do not know how to hold on. If she leaves, I will be nothing but a hollow shell. Please, let me find the courage before it is too late." The journal slipped from her hands. She pressed her fist to her mouth, her entire body shaking. He loved her. He had always loved her. The coldness, the distance, it had all been a shield, and she had nearly been destroyed by it. But she was still here. They were still here. She found him in the library, standing by the window, staring out at the gray winter sky. He turned when she entered, and the look on her face made him go pale. "Genevieve," he said, his voice rough with alarm. "What has happened?" She held up the journal, her hand trembling. I read it, all of it, the debts, the letters, the entries. A tear slipped down her cheek. "You loved me from the beginning. Why did you never tell me? 3 years, Alexander, 3 years of silence. I thought you despised me." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped just short of touching her, his hands hovering as if he were afraid she might shatter. His gray eyes were wet, and his composure, that iron control he had worn like armor, finally broke. "Because I was a coward," he said hoarsely. "Because I was broken. My first wife, Helena, she never loved me. She loved another man, and she died bearing his child. I covered the scandal to protect my family, but the wound never healed. I believed I was unworthy of love, and when I married you, I was terrified. Terrified that you would discover the truth and see me as she did, a cold, unlovable shell. So I pushed you away before you could leave me." He drew a shuddering breath, and his voice dropped to a broken whisper. "But I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. When I saw you with Prescott, I nearly lost my mind. When you were ill, I could not breathe. Genevieve, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I am begging you, do not leave me. I cannot live without you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain and longing. Genevieve looked at the man before her, not the cold, distant Duke, but a wounded, terrified soul who had loved her in the dark. And she realized that her heart had never truly stopped loving him either. She had only buried it to survive. Slowly she reached up and cupped his face in her hands. He flinched at the tenderness, as if he had never expected to receive it. "I am not Helena," she said softly, "and you are not unworthy. You are the man who saved me, who watched over me, who loved me even when I thought I was invisible. I will not leave you, Alexander. I am your wife, and I am here. I have always been here." A choked sound escaped him, and then his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest with a desperate strength. He buried his face in her hair and wept, the tears he had held back for years finally falling. She held him just as tightly, her own tears mingling with his, and in the quiet of the library they began to heal. That winter Rothwell Hall changed. The icy silence that had hung over it for so long melted into something warmer. Alexander and Genevieve took their meals together, walked the frosty gardens hand in hand, and talked for hours by the fire. He told her everything, the full story of Helena's betrayal, the secret child, the weight of shame he had carried. She listened without judgment, and in her steady gaze he found the absolution he had never thought possible. On Christmas morning, Genevieve gave him a gift. It was a portrait she had drawn of the two of them, standing side by side in the garden, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, both of them smiling. Beneath it she had written, "Finally seen." He looked at it for a long time, his eyes glistening, and then he kissed her forehead with a reverence that made her heart swell. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel invisible again," he promised, and she believed him. The spring that followed was the sweetest either of them had ever known. The Duchess of Rothwell was no longer a shadow at the edge of ballrooms. She walked into every room on her husband's arm, her head held high, her smile genuine. Society whispered again, but this time the whispers were of envy. The Duke of Rothwell, they said, had become utterly devoted to his wife. He rarely let her out of his sight, and when he looked at her, his cold eyes held a warmth that softened the hardest edges of his reputation. One evening they stood together on the terrace where she had once fled from heartbreak. The moon was bright, and the scent of roses drifted on the breeze. Alexander turned to her, his expression open and unguarded in a way that still made her breath catch. "I loved you too late," he said quietly. "I wasted so much time." Genevieve shook her head and laced her fingers through his. "You loved me in the silence. Now I can finally hear it." She rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. He turned his head and captured her lips in a kiss that was tender and full of promise, and the moonlight wrapped around them like a blessing. She had waited 3 years to be seen. And now, in the arms of the man who had loved her all along, Genevieve was finally home.